Hello, and welcome to I'm Afraid There's Been a Murder, an Agatha Christie podcast. I'm your host, Victoria. The aim of this podcast is to go through all of Agatha Christie's murder novels, all 66 of them, in chronological order, the order that they were written in, and critique, review, maybe even solve some of them. Maybe we can figure it out. Now, I haven't read all of these previous to this, but between all of the ones I've read and all of the Poirot and Miss Marple TV and movies that I've watched, there's a good chance that there's only maybe 5 or 6 of these that I haven't actually interacted with in any way. But more than just enjoying each murder on its own, I really wanted to go through chronologically and kind of see how these murders develop, whether or not we get phases of stuff, just kind of seeing how they were written and kind of dissecting them and treating them as also products of their time, not just individual murders created in a vacuum. Because I think with so many books written, it's easy to get all of these stories mixed up. It's easy to reread them and enjoy them repeatedly, because so often it's hard to distinguish the characters and sometimes even the settings between books. It's easy to get them all mixed up. And if you read any number of these for any length of time, it's easy to kind of mix them all up, and they're all kind of like a jumble in your head. Like, you know what an Agatha Christie is, you know what the atmosphere is like, you know what the vibes are, you kind of know some of her tricks, but they can all run together sometimes. It'd be like, I have my favorites, of course, the ones that stand out, but there's definitely some that I've watched or read 3 or 4 times and I never remember the ending. So I kind of wanted to get a sense of them, not just as individual murders that I can just open up Poirot, all 16 seasons or whatever, pick one and know that I'm going to have a good time. I want to kind of put them in a context for myself and kind of enjoy them in that way. So my goal is to go through all of these murders. I don't intend to read all of them unless there's not a TV or movie adaptation, which I think for the vast majority there are, just based on time, because committing to reading 66 novels in a year is a lot. But I do find that the TV and movie adaptations, aside from some of the more recent Poirots, which, we'll get to eventually, aside from some more recent interpretations, the TV and movies do tend to stick very, very closely to the script, the original text. So I feel like this is a pretty faithful way to go about it without, not being able to ever read anything else for the next year or two. But yeah, I'm really excited to jump in on this big project. I want to take you with me. I do think that at some point I will throw some other murders in there just to keep things fresh. But yeah, that's my plan. I hope that you can listen along with me. So today we are going to get in on The Mysterious Affair at Styles. So this was published in 1920, published first in the US and a year later in the UK. And this is a Poirot. So we don't get Miss Marple for quite a while. I think Miss Marple appears first 10 years later. The first few are Hercule Poirot, Tommy and Tuppence, and then we have Colonel Race, who's appeared a couple of times, and Superintendent Battle, that I've never seen before. I recognize The Secret of Chimneys. I do have some memories of that one, but I don't. Superintendent Battle's a fresh one. I'm just looking at a list of all of them, but today we're starting with Poirot, a classic. If you would like to watch along, this is season 3, episode 1 of the Poirot TV series. It's an hour and a half about, but I will be spoiling the answer at the end. So what I want to do is kind of walk you through this murder. I'm going to walk you through all the suspects, give you all of the clues, see if we can solve it before the solution at the end. And then I just kind of want to talk about how this sits as a first entry as someone who's read and watched a lot of other stuff by her later, and see how this kind of stacks up as an entry point into Agatha Christie. So let's get started. The mysterious affair at Styles starts when Hastings is met by an old friend, John Cavendish, while he is recovering in a military hospital. The war is still going on, so this would be World War I, and Hastings appears to be recovering from a leg injury, which immediately makes me think of the first Sherlock Holmes entry, right? Where Watson comes back from Afghanistan, which was the war at the time, and has his leg injury, and he's recovering and he's on a cane and all of that. So there's definitely some immediate parallels where she's taking inspiration from Conan Doyle here. But anyway, John, Hastings' friend, is inviting him down to a sprawling country manor house for, to help him recuperate because he's like almost healed, but like not quite. So we are immediately thrust into the classic Agatha Christie setting of this manor house, and there's a bunch of people invited, and someone's definitely going to get murdered, and it can only be one of the people in this country manor house full of rich English people, right? Classic. So I'm going to go through all of the suspects. There's quite a few, as there usually is in Agatha Christie. I remember reading once that there was a very deliberate choice that she always made to include just slightly too many characters, like just a few too many people that you can't really keep all of them straight in your head, which, I mean, it feels kind of like cheating a little bit, right? Like, if it was only 5 suspects, it would be much easier to kind of suss things out, but because there's just a few too many people, and it's a short book, and they're all these rich British people who, like, I'm sure at the time the characters seemed a lot more distinct from each other, but because so much time has passed, and in a lot of cases we don't really get these kinds of characters, or certainly I haven't met many of these kinds of characters in real life, they can tend to all blend together a little bit for us. But I'm going to try to be as clear as possible about all of these people. So here we go. In the order that we meet them, we have John Cavendish, who is in his 40s. He's relatively handsome. He's married. He's rich. That's about it. On the way to the country house, we kind of see Mrs. Raikes, who John introduces as a farmer's widow who lives near there. Hastings remarks on the fact that she's rather attractive, and John is like, yeah, I guess. So we have Mrs. Raikes, the widow. We then have Miss Evelyn, who is one of the many servants that we meet. She seems to be some kind of, like, we meet her outside gardening, but she's not a gardener. She seems to appear to be some sort of like assistant or secretary to the lady who owns the house. So John Cavendish doesn't own this giant manor house that he's inviting his friend to. It's owned by his mother, who we'll get to. But first we meet Evelyn, who is kind of this, I would describe her as sturdy and kind of what you would imagine like the matron of a girls' school is how I would describe her. She's got like the shorter hair, she's got kind of like the matronly dress, she's got the goggles on. She does have this warmth that I wouldn't necessarily associate with a governess, but like everything else, kind of like that's how you can picture her. She seems very smart and capable. Definitely like a no-nonsense sort of person, but not mean about it. Then we meet Miss Emily Inglethorpe, which is the lady of the house. She is very wealthy. She's in her, I would say, probably mid-70s, but she's like not being wheeled around in a wheelchair. She's very like well put together and well taken care of, and she's doing all sorts of businessy things. We don't really get like a great sense of her, but she seems to be a very nice hostess, and she's happy to have Hastings there. While we meet Emily, we also meet her husband, Alfred, who is recently married to Emily. So it's John's stepdad. And he's about John's age, if not a little younger. So it's immediately really awkward. He looks like a cartoon supervillain. He's got kind of the older-fashioned, even for the 1920s, he's got these old-fashioned black suit that I would associate with maybe like 20 to 40 years earlier. He's got like this dark black beard. He's got the little circular glasses. I get big evil psychiatrist vibes from this guy. Like, he is tenting his fingers and cackling to himself as he thinks about giving you a lobotomy. That is the vibes that we get. It's very obvious that John, especially, is very uncomfortable with this man. Like, it's just weird to everybody. Nobody likes him. Later, we then meet Mary Cavendish, which is John's wife. She's pretty, she's blonde, she's about his age, which is nice. We then also meet Dorcas, the maid, who's in her 50s and seems very capable and nice. Then we meet Cynthia and Lawrence. I keep calling him Leonard. It's Lawrence. So Cynthia is Emily's niece, so John's cousin. And we find out that she works as a pharmacist. Lawrence is a doctor, and he's John's brother, also Emily's son. So we have Emily at the kind of head of the family tree. She's married recently to Alfred. She has 2 sons, John and Lawrence, and then the cousin Cynthia. We're not entirely sure how she's related, but she's Emily's niece. So those are all of our potential suspects. Those are all of the people in the vicinity. So we have 9 people in total, 10 at the house completely if you want to count Hastings, 8 suspects if you account for the fact that one of these people is going to be murdered. Take your bets, which one now? So Hastings, after meeting all of these people, it's dinner time. He talks over dinner about how he met Poirot when he was fighting in Belgium, and how he was a suspect in a murder case that Poirot goes on to solve, and that's how they become friends. I don't know if Agatha Christie ever wrote that story. I would be very interested to see that story, but it seems like she's jump-starting this kind of in the middle. So we don't get this introduction kind of from the beginning like we see with detectives like Conan Doyle, who she would have known at the time. I think this is a good move. It usually makes more sense to start in the middle when things get interesting, regardless of what kind of story you have here. That way we get to skip kind of some of the parts of like Hastings getting to know Poirot, even though we do spend a bit of time in this episode, in this story, kind of learning that Poirot is eccentric. But she does a very good job of showing that rather than telling us. Hastings does say he's a bit of a dandy, but we don't really get more than that until we see him. I would be really curious to see if she ever did write what case Poirot solved where Hastings was a suspect, but this is a good starting place. This is fine. Over dinner, because Hastings has brought up being a detective, everyone starts talking casually about poisons, which is obviously just light dinner conversation, and not foreshadowing at all. Not at all. John mentions the next day that while he gets his mother's multiple houses upon her death, Alfred gets all the money. I also tend to share the contents of my parents' will to strangers and friends at any point during long weekends that we spend together, so this also feels very, natural and casual in conversation. Evelyn, we find out that day, is leaving her position after telling Mrs. Inglethorpe what she thinks of her new husband. She says, quote, "There's no fool like an old fool." She's like, this guy is obviously terrible. He's 20 years her junior. What is she doing? He's just gold digging. We hate him. Everyone hates him. I'm sick of it. And obviously Emily, Mrs. Inglethorpe, fires her. So everyone's really sad to see her go. It seems like she's very well loved amongst the family. And Evelyn tells Hastings to keep his eyes open. She very clearly suspects that Alfred is going to murder his wife. And she really wants him to, have his eye on Alfred while she's gone. She feels kind of bad that she's leaving Emily alone to the machinations of this terrible man, right? Hastings then runs into Poirot, as Poirot is desperately trying to acquire enough cocoa for hot chocolate despite the war rations. So Hastings is out running an errand and they run into each other. Poirot is there with a group of refugees from Belgium, and he's kind of acting like a tour guide. Hastings doesn't invite him up to the manor house, but we know that Poirot's in the vicinity, so we know what's going to happen. Back at the house, we overhear Emily yelling, but we don't really get a sense of what the actual issue is. We hear that Emily has said something about a scandal between husband and wife, and she's very upset. We do not hear who else is in the room. We find out, also, that John Cavendish is having an affair with the pretty Mrs. Rakes, and his wife knows about it, and she is livid. So, that brings us to the night of the murder. It's a hot summer night. After dinner, Alfred says he's going into the village to deal with something boring, and that no one need wait up for him. Panning around the room, we see that nobody was going to wait up for him, but, you know. Everyone else is in the house and accounted for, except for, obviously, the servant who was fired. So, everyone on our list is there except for Alfred and Evie. That night, Hastings is woken up by John banging on his mother's door. Hastings opens his door to see basically everyone outside Mrs. Inglethorpe's room, and we hear she's screaming she is in distress. Her door is locked, so the maid suggests going through her husband's adjoining room. That door is locked too. Apparently, Cynthia also sleeps in an adjoining room, but we see Mary is in there, and she says that the door is locked too, but also Cynthia's not waking up. Mary says she must have taken a sleeping powder, and I don't know what they put in sleeping powders back then, but it seems to have been some good stuff, because Mary is like shaking this woman and she is not waking up, and like they're screaming and pounding, and she is just, Cynthia is out. Cynthia is just out. So maybe cut back on that sleeping powder dose, man. That's some good stuff. Okay. Eventually, they break down one of the adjoining doors, and they immediately demand brandy for this woman who is, she's like writhing around in bed. She's in bed with like the covers tucked up. She's in her nightgown, but she is like clearly in pain. And surely brandy will fix it. Medicine in the 20s. The doctor is summoned. He gets there very fast. But surprise, surprise, she dies dramatically in her son's arms. Her last words are, "Alfred, help." So make of that what you will. Okay, so the murder has happened. We know all our suspects. Make your guess now about what happened. Right now, my best guess is it was either John or Mary. They both have the most motive outside of Alfred, and I think I would rule out Alfred almost immediately because he seems so obvious, right? We know these tricks from Agatha Christie. I am going to guess that someone has drugged Cynthia and used her room to get in and out of Mrs. Inglethorpe's bedroom. Mary had the best opportunity to poison Mrs. Inglethorpe's coffee after dinner, but of course anything could have been poisoned. She could have like had a needle between her toes or like whatever, so I still think it's a wide game. We will narrow it down soon, but I think John and Mary seem like the best suspects to me right now. So that's my first guess. I'm gonna lock that in. So that morning, the doctor says that it was strychnine poisoning. Hastings immediately obviously invites Poirot in and is like, this is, there's a murder. Here's Poirot. This is a no-brainer. I have Leonard here. Lawrence, his name is Lawrence. Lawrence, the doctor brother, says it's a bad idea. He doesn't believe it was poison. He just thinks that there's no way that it could have been. It must have been an accident somehow. But John is like, no, this is a murder. We're getting a good detective in. And therefore, we have invited Poirot. As Hastings leaves to summon Poirot, Alfred is only just coming back to the house. Alfred says he forgot his key and he had to stay late at a friend's. Right. Sure. He's not crying. He's not particularly distressed by this, it seems. He says that his poor, selfless Emily must have overtaxed herself. I'm not sure being too nice is a cause of death, Alfred, but good try there, buddy. Okay, so now we have Poirot. Hastings has gone and got him. We are gonna get into clues. So I'm just gonna list all of the clues as we collect them. There are 22 clues in total for those keeping track at home. So, clue number 1, Emily hardly ate anything last night. Number 2, she retired to bed around 8 p.m., so rather early. Number 3, Emily got sick and started screaming about 5 a.m., and Poirot points out that strychnine would likely act faster than that if she was poisoned around dinner. Like, she would be experiencing symptoms pretty much immediately after she took it, or at least within a few hours. And if she ate, let's say, around like 6 or 7, and for it to be 5, like, that's 10 hours is a lot of time for it to take. So he calls into question the assumption that she was poisoned around dinner time. As we examine her room, we see that there is kind of like a dark blue fuzz found on the bolt of the adjoining door between Cynthia and Emily's room. We don't really, nobody's wearing blue clothes. We haven't seen anyone in blue yet, so that doesn't immediately point to anybody. We find that the items on the bedside table were broken, which includes the lamp, which is broken into 2 pieces, and also the teacup that she had full of hot cocoa, which is a normal thing that she does before bed. But the teacup is smashed almost into a powder. So it is like really, really broken. Poirot suggests it was either crushed deliberately because it, A, contained poison, or B, because it didn't contain poison. So take it that way you will. We notice there's a coffee stain under the desk. There's also a spot of a melted wax candle on the carpet. Hastings brings up that we know Leonard brought a candle into the room when Emily was dying, but Poirot points out that it was the wrong color candle. So we assume it was murder or murder adjacent when that happened. We see letters were burned in the bedroom fireplace that night. It is possible that it was a will that was burned. We find some fragments that say it could have been a will and testament, but we don't get any much more information than that. It's kind of just assumed that that's what it was. We find out from Dorcas that Emily received an upsetting letter that day. She said, "You can't ever trust a man, can you?" and had like her handkerchief, and she was very, very upset. She doesn't actually say what the letter was about, though, of course. Dorcas says that Emily took the last sleeping pill that she had 2 days ago, and then had run out. But she does also mention a tonic that she usually takes at night. We don't know yet what is in that tonic or what it's for. We find that someone forced the lock of Emily's briefcase where she keeps all of her important documents. And this happens later in the day after Poirot investigates. So he goes up and he does his thing in the bedroom, and then they go back up to check it later, and we find that the briefcase has been tampered with. Poirot also draws attention here to how sinister Alfred looks and points out like his beard and his glasses and just how weird he is. And then we get to the inquest. So we don't see everyone talking at the inquest, but there are a few things that come up. So Mary, John's wife, despite having said that she was right outside the open window when Emily and Alfred were arguing, she doesn't hear any details, and is overall just like really suspicious about it. She's not saying anything about what she heard, so either she wasn't where she said she was, or she's protecting the person that Emily was arguing with. The local druggist comes up to the stand and recalls that Alfred bought strychnine about a week before Emily's death. Alfred claims he didn't buy it. Alfred also claims that he didn't argue with Emily that afternoon. Lawrence continues to argue that the poisoning was accidental because there was some strychnine in the tonic that Emily usually takes. And so it's possible that she took some sort of overdose. I don't know what normal reason you would have for taking something with just a little bit of strychnine in it. But again, the wonders of 1920s medicine. The coroner, in response to Lawrence, says that there wasn't enough of a dose left in the tonic for Emily to overdose on it. There was only like a little bit left in the bottle, so it couldn't have been accidental. Poirot confirms that Alfred does have an alibi for the time he was meant to be buying poison, despite the fact that he refused to say what the alibi was. It seems like Poirot didn't uncover anything scandalous, but it seems weird to lie about something like that when it's so important and he's the prime suspect, right? We then find in the attic, there's like a dress-up chest, and Poirot finds a fake beard that looks exactly like Alfred's. Cynthia. Also, we have this little kind of moment with Cynthia and Hastings in the garden, and Cynthia, pretty little cousin Cynthia, is upset that she wasn't provided for in the will. And Hastings kind of like talks her around about that, saying that she'll find like a nice man that will take care of her or whatever. At this point, John Cavendish is arrested by Inspector Japp. We find out in court that John loaned Mrs. Raikes a bunch of money. And that appears to have been the contents of the letter that distressed Emily that day. That she found out that John was loaning her about £200, which, let me just do a brief calculation here. So that would have been $11,000 in 2024 money. So that's not an insignificant amount. That's 11,000 pounds. So even more in dollars, probably close to $15,000. So that's quite a bit of money that he's lent her. We also find out that Japp discovered an empty poison bottle in John's room, which, if you've ever read an Agatha Christie, you know that doesn't mean much. And also, and this is where I start to have a couple of problems with this story, is Poirot takes an item we don't see to a lab, and we find that the chemical test for strychnine causes it to form colorless crystals at the bottom of the testing bottle. So the strychnine all kind of coalesces at the bottom of the bottle. Okay, so those are all of the clues. Please make your final guesses now. Who do you think did it? How do you think it was done? There are some twisty bits here, so just... All right, we got it? You're locked in? Okay, let's get into the solution. So, Poirot assembles everyone there in typical Poirot fashion. And once everyone is listening with rapt attention to him, he says that Mary is the one who left the fuzz on the door. We don't see him gathering, like, this clue. He's asked around a bit about this blue fuzz, but we don't actually see him finding the thing, but apparently he has attached the fuzz to Mary, and that feels a little bit unfair. He calls attention to the fact that we only thought the adjoining door from Cynthia's room was locked because Mary said it was. No one actually checked, but Mary was already in Cynthia's room by the time Hastings got there, and Mary was like, this is definitely locked. So Poirot explains that Mary was there in the bedroom thinking that Emily had evidence of her husband's affair. She wanted to see it for herself. I don't know why Emily didn't give that to her, if that was what it was. They have a weird relationship, I guess. And then Mary leaves the candle wax there as she's startled because Emily starts to scream in the middle of the night. So that's how all of that gets there. Poirot then explains how John is the one who is arguing with his mother over the money that he lent Mrs. Raikes. Emily rewrites the will and cuts John out of it, which this was something I saw coming from very early on, just because you never hear Alfred's side of the argument, and I think you've probably picked up on the fact that I didn't say it was Alfred. Everyone assumed it was Alfred because she was arguing about husband and wife, but we also have another husband and wife. So typical Agatha Christie misdirection. I don't know that I would have caught it if this had been the first Agatha Christie that I read. So like, we'll still give her full credit for that, but that was definitely something I saw coming. So as Emily rewrites the will, in the process of that, Emily discovers a disturbing letter amongst Alfred's belongings. Poirot explains that the method of poisoning was the tonic. Someone added Emily's sleeping powder to her tonic, a sleeping powder which caused the chemical reaction of making the last dose full of all the strychnine in the bottle. I do have a little bit of a problem with this. It was never mentioned what was in the sleeping powder before. So, like, I don't know that I would have put that together, but, like, once we see Poirot in the lab, we do kind of get the sense that someone could have created this chemical reaction, and I don't think it really matters that it was the sleeping pills, especially since we know that both Cynthia and Lawrence are related to, they know enough chemistry that both of them could have done it or could have instructed someone else on how to do it, right? So I don't necessarily think that it's important that it was the sleeping pills, but suffice to say that chemical reaction happened, so it could have been anyone at any time. They just had to wait for Emily to get to the bottom of the bottle. It wasn't like someone had to sneak in that night. Could have been anybody at any time. Then, the incriminating letter is retrieved. The letter was hidden in the murder room. That part's a bit convoluted. It doesn't really matter. The point is they found it. And the letter is found to unveil an affair between Evelyn and Alfred. Evelyn, who this whole time has been like, Alfred's the worst. We hate him. Get rid of Alfred. They've been doing the dirty this whole time. So Emily figures this out and tells absolutely no one. Like, she finds the letter contains basically their entire plot. It's like, my dearest Evelyn, wow, you had such a good idea with those sleeping pills. I can't wait until this terrible woman is dead. And, like, the letter stops midway, but, like, I can't imagine finding that letter and not telling anybody. Like, that's immediately go to the police. Like, immediately go to the cops if you find your husband has written a letter about how he's so excited to murder you with, like, names written. Like, what? And, like, also don't eat or drink anything in that house. Like, what? Okay, so that doesn't feel great. And it also feels like we couldn't have really gotten there from the clues that we had. I don't think this one was solvable. We really didn't get all the information. It really doesn't make sense for them to be like, okay, Alfred's going to be the main suspect. So we have to then dress up as Alfred and go buy some strychnine. But we'll give him an alibi, but he won't tell anybody about the alibi. Someone else has to figure out the alibi, because if he gives an alibi, then it's going to be too obvious, right? So Evelyn dresses up as him to go buy the strychnine, and then he has to deny it, and nobody believes him, and, like, just go to a different town and buy the strychnine as Evelyn. Like, just, you know, that didn't have to, that was a bit of a stretch for me. Or, like, I don't know, the strychnine was, like, the strychnine was already there, right? So they didn't even need to buy the poison, because the poison already existed in the tonic. They just had to make sure that it, like, coalesced together. The more I think about it, the less that this makes sense. But you know what? This is her first murder. We will give Miss Agatha the benefit of the doubt here. It was still perfectly entertaining. Despite all that, I think this was a solid entry. It really does define her style. Like, it's the typical lord in a country house. There's a locked room mystery. You know, it has all the elements that you really like from Agatha Christie. And the fact that, like, you can't really solve it, but, like, you feel like you almost could. I feel like this is a perfectly solid murder mystery. It's still entertaining to kind of have the unraveling. And there's a real sense of drama here, especially when we get that long reveal with Poirot that I don't really remember seeing, if at all, very frequently in murders of the time. Like, there's always a big reveal at the end, and, like, that's always satisfying. But there's this sense of theater with the way that Poirot assembles everyone and, like, goes through all the suspects and, like, these are all the things that you did wrong, and these are all the red herrings. That is really entertaining and really helps build the tension at the end. So that wraps up the mystery. We get, like, some epilogue stuff at the very end where Hastings is kind of asking Poirot to fill in the blanks. He doesn't answer any of the questions that I had, but we do find out that Cynthia has found a man to take care of her, and that happens to be her cousin Lawrence, who is going to marry her. Not great. I know you can have a cousin that you're not blood related to. I understand that, but like, ew. First of all, they don't explicitly say at any point. I might have to go back and rewatch it, but like, she's a cousin. She is a cousin. They don't explicitly say, I think, that she's not a blood relative. And even if she's not, like, they grew up together as cousins, and that's just very small town 1920s. I guess you take what you can get, right? It's World War I. There's not a lot of eligible bachelors. I'm trying not to judge, but oh boy. So yeah, that is The Mysterious Affair at Styles. That was the first mystery. The next episode, we are going to talk about the next one, which is The Secret Adversary, which is a Tommy and Tuppence murder. So if you want to watch ahead, there is a kind of made for TV movie on BritBox or Acorn TV that you can watch. So go watch that if you want to have a discussion about that. If not, I will spell it all out for you again. But either way, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you had a good time unraveling this mystery with me. And I will see you next time. Bye.